This is the artist who calls himself Fake Zappa with another reading. I think this is part 19, and I've been doing this for over a year now. And I want to go a little more into detail about why this is my Bible. But before I do that, I still have to explain a little bit about why Fake Zappa talks so much about Fake Zappa and not so much about Frank Zappa. And it's part of a tribute of being Fake Zappa, not necessarily to the music of Frank Zappa, it's to the life and to the basically the thinking and sort of the ideology, the worldview, the dead Zappa, which means Frank, which is a very disrespectful way. It's just one of the other reasons why I like to talk about myself is because there's a lot of things I'm doing to scare away the Zappa fans. The Zappa files, in my opinion, in my dealings with them, and even doing these videos about his book, I've noticed that they are some of the most plastic people I've ever dealt with. And I say that their plasticism is kind of elevated with their hypocrisy, because they identify with Frank Zappa, and at the same time, I haven't met anybody who has paid the price that Mr. Zappa had with learning his craft pretty much on his own and suffering the abuse of power from authority figures and being an innovator and not getting the credit for it, and just having a life of constantly being in places where he had to fight folks that didn't see the value in what he did. Like there was a couple of chapters ago where he's talking about how he's dealing with these venues that are charging him thousands of dollars for these stupid fees, these stupid costs that they're adding to him. And the weird thing is that even though he was a household name, they were still treating him like he was worthless. And still to this day, like I was chatting with a classical snob about a year ago who was out of state, and we were talking, and so I mentioned I was listening to London Symphony Orchestra, and they were talking about Stumpy Tits. He's like, what? I said, yeah, it's 200 Motels with the London Symphony Orchestra and Zappa. Well, this guy was so into classical, and at the same time, he didn't recognize one of the most respected classical composers in Europe is Frank Zappa, especially in Eastern Europe. And it's interesting how a lot of Americans, especially classical snobs, and especially even jazz snobs, don't even recognize him as having contributed to their genre. And so, anyways, enough about Frank. I'm supposed to talk about me and why this is my Bible. And when I was a Bible believer, and I won't get much into detail because this is a long chapter, I'm going into Porn Wars, which is an amazing album that he did, an amazing project that he did, and he turned what seemed like a political failure into an art form. Now, mind you, when it came to the PMRC, I mean, that thing, like, who's ever heard of them in the last 30 years or so? And so when it comes to acts of trying to censor rock and roll, they didn't seem to go any further than they did. And if it wasn't for Mr. Zappa and maybe a few others like him, and especially the outcries of the public, all we get is a parental advisory. And that's a pretty good compromise, considering what they wanted to do was to completely snuff everybody out. And if you think the internet is free, that's okay. I'll let you believe that. Also, if you're lucid, then I will ask you a favor, is that when I talk about how Mr. Zappa is portraying these conservatives. Now, also, we got to remember that Tipper Gore, and Al Gore was running as a Democrat. So we're not just dealing with Republicans here. We're dealing with folks that have their way into the left wing and the Democrats and progressives and whatever. And yeah, 30, 35 years ago, there was still a lot of biblical baggage for the simple fact that a lot of these folks in charge are born in the 20s. And now we're dealing with a lot of folks in charge now that are born in the 40s. And now we're going to get assholes that are my age, born in the 60s and the 70s, who were born in this sexual revolution. And that's even more fucked up because we've got all this left-wing hypocrisy. So what we're dealing with here in the last 5 years, especially when it comes to censorship, and I don't think I'm the only one that sees this, is who's getting in trouble for speaking out, whether it's true or not, whether it's full of shit or not, because obviously, like, when it comes to a lot of the shit that was being censored, when it comes to, like, the fire and whips and chains, I mean, I don't like that shit. Still, though, they have a right to do that shit. And if you start telling kids not to listen to it, it's going to make it more appealing to them. So what's going on in the last 5 years? It's the fucking redneck army. And it's looking really appealing to these young people who are being disappointed by their parents who are my age, that are fucking granola crunchers and tree huggers. And we're telling them to be mindful of their green fingerprint or their carbon footprint or whatever it is. And at the same time, we're treating them like shit. And so it's pretty obvious that they're going to start going into a lot of extreme right-wing ideas and stuff like that. So basically, I'm saying that to compare how Mr. Zappa, who identified as a conservative, spent a lot of time and money and effort. And in fact, there was several years in the 80s where he didn't tour, and a lot of that was spent fighting this fucking censorship thing, which came from those that identified as conservatives. So it was interesting. He identified as a conservative, and he fought conservatives because back then, the big thing was conservatives trying to censor liberals. And now, the big thing, if you turn on your TV, especially in the last year, has been the left-wing sort of influence in the mainstream media. It's very gay-friendly. It's more anti-religious. It's definitely more of a left-wing slant. And on Tuesday, for instance, it was the 4th. It wasn't even the anniversary of this insurrection thing and they're still making Republicans look stupid. But back then, it was the Republican influence trying to make the liberals look stupid. And now it's really turned around. So that's what I see when I read this, is boy, the tables sure have turned around. And in my life, I identify as a liberal, and I find myself doing the same shit to a lot of liberals. Of like, hey, this redneck army, they have a right to express their views, even though it doesn't sound very politically correct. And a lot of times they don't know how to spell your and your correctly in the right context. They still have a right to be heard, and the more we censor them, the more it's going to look appealing to young people. So anyways, I will probably have to interrupt this broadcast for a few seconds at a time to let in the cats. It's now in the 30s, which is still really nice compared to Minneapolis or any of these other places. Because here it is, January. And we're into another year of the pandemic era, and we still are suffering from the influence of Mr. Trump and all this shit, and we still don't know what happened. And if you want to know what happened, don't read a book called What Happened, even if Mrs. Clinton wrote it herself. Read this book and try to find out if this shit is still going on and how and who's doing it and why are they doing it. Chapter 15, Porn Wars. And look at Frank Zappa with his short hair, his necktie, and his extremely immaculately trimmed mustache and epic signature soul patch. So, anyways, this is something from The Merchant of Venice, Act 5, Scene 1. The man that hath no music in himself, nor is not moved with concord of sweet sounds, is fit for treasons, stratagems, and spoils. The motions of his spirit are dull as night, and his affections are dark as Erebus. Let no such man be trusted. Mark the music. Page 261. The background history of the Parents Music Resource Center, or PMRC, would take up more space than it's worth to spell it out in detail. There are several historical accounts from which to choose. Let's arbitrarily choose this one. One day in 1985, Tipper Gore, wife of Democratic senator from Tennessee, bought her 8-year-old a copy of the soundtrack album from Prince's Purple Rain, an R-rated film which had already generated considerable controversy for its sexual content. For some reason, however, she was shocked when their daughter pointed out a reference to masturbation in a song called Darling Nikki. Tipper rounded up a bunch of her Washington housewife friends, most of who happened to be married to influential members of the U.S. Senate, and founded the PMRC. Thank you, Darling Nikki. On or about May 31st, 1985, the PMRC sent a letter to Stanley Gorsukoff, then president of the Recording Industry Association of America, also known as RIAA, accusing the record industry of exposing the youth of America to sex, violence, and the glorification of drugs and alcohol. Maybe they hadn't been watching television lately. The letter went on to demand the rating system of folk records, similar to the MPAA rating system for films. The signatures included Gore, Susan Baker, wife of Treasury Secretary James Baker, with one K, Pam Hauer, and Sally Nemius, wives of prominent Washington businessmen, and the wives of 9 other U.S. senators. Within moments, Edward O. Fritz, president of the National Association of Broadcasters, wrote letters to 4,500 commercial radio stations, implying that if they broadcast songs with explicit lyrics, they would be at risk of losing their licenses. As this frenzy for self-mutilation developed, people within the record broadcast industry debated amongst themselves as to what the most prudent course of action might be. In other words, they were all in such a hurry to bend over for these harpies that only details left for them to decide were when to bend over, how far to bend over, when to bend, do we spread? Who's got the Crisco? So in a music trade publication called Cashbox, I wrote them an open letter. Extortion. Pure and simple. An open letter to the music industry. With all due respect to Stan Gordikov and the RIAA, I would like a few moments of your time to express my personal feelings regarding the unfortunate decision to bend over for the PMRC on the issue of album identification. First, let me say that I appreciate the difficult position the RIAA is in and sympathize fully with the organization's struggle to move legislation through Congress. The problem seems to be the Thurmond Committee. This is where the industry proposed legislation will live or die. It is no secret that Mrs. Thurmond is a member of the PMRC. What is apparently happening is a case of extortion, pure and simple. The RIAA must tap dance for these Washington wives, or the industry's bill will feel the wrath of their famous husbands. It is to the RIAA's credit that the bulk of the PMRC's demands were rejected. However, capitulation on the snickering issue will cause more problems than it will solve. The PMRC makes no secret of their intentions to use, quote, special relationships, end quote, to force the issue. In an interview on an Albany radio station, Mrs. Hoare made reference to a Mr. Fowler at the FCC, suggesting that some intervention by this agency might be in order, should be their other nefarious techniques fail. Did somebody rewrite the FCC charter while we weren't looking? What's going on here? Extortion is still an illegal act. Conspiracy to commit extortion is an illegal act. And this issue goes beyond First Amendment considerations. No person married or related to a governmental official should be permitted to waste the nation's time on ill-conceived housewife hobby projects such as this. The PMRC's case is totally without merit, based on a hodgepodge of fundamentalist frogwash and illogical conclusions. Shrieking in terror at the thought of someone hearing references to masturbation on a print record they put out on their Guardian of the People costumes, and the media comes running. It is an unfortunate trend of the 80s that the slightest murmur from a special interest group, especially when it has friends in high places, causes a knee-jerk reaction of appeasement from a wide range of industries that we ought to know better. If you are an artist reading this, think for the moment of... Did anyone ask you if you wanted to have the stigma of potential filth plopped onto your next release via this appeasement sticker? If you are a songwriter, did anyone ask if you wanted to spend the rest of your career modifying your lyric content to suit the spiritual needs of an imaginary 11-year-old? The answer is obviously no. In all of this, the main concern has been the business agenda of major labels versus the egos and sexual neurosis of these vigilant ladies. A record company has the right to conduct its business and to make a profit, but not at the expense of the people who make the product possible. Someone still has to write and perform the music. The RIAA has taken what I feel is to be a short-sighted approach to the issue. The voluntary sticker will not appease these creatures, nor will it grease the chute through the Thurmond Committee. There are no promises or guarantees here, only threats and insurrections from the PMRC. And I don't know. The RIAA has shown a certain disregard for the creative people of the industry and their eagerness to protect the revenues of the record companies. Ladies and gentlemen, we are all in this together. ... When you watch the hostages on TV, didn't you sort of mumble to yourselves, let's nuke them? The PMRC deserves nothing less, and the same to the NMRC or any other censorship group with a broadcast blacklist in their back pocket. For the elected officials who sit idly by while their wives run rabid with anti-sexual pseudo-Christian legislative fervor, there lurks the potential for the same sort of dumb embarrassment caused by Billy Carter's fascinating exploits. I do not deny anyone the right to their opinions on any matter, but when certain people's opinions have the potential to influence my life and the lives of my children because of their special access to legislative machinery, I think it raises important questions of law. Ronald Reagan came to office with the proclaimed intention of getting the federal government off our backs. The secret agenda seems to not to remove it, but to force certain people to wear it like a lampshade at a DC Tupperware party. Nobody looks good wearing brown lipstick. These creatures can hurt you. Get mad. Fight back. Use the phone. Use the telex. Demand that Congress deal with the substantive issue of cannibal insider trading and power brokerage. Demand censure for those elected officials who participate. Demand fairness for the record industry's legislation in the Thurman Committee. Remind them that they have the duty to the people who elected them that takes priority over their domestic relationships. Here he is diligently at his typewriter. Did anyone give a shit about this? No. So I decided to write an open letter to the president, which read in part, page 266. Mr. President, even though I disagree strongly with the many administration policies, I have never doubted that your personal views on the basic constitutional issues are sincere. I would like to know your opinion of the record censorship program sponsored by the PMRC, an organization involving the lives of elected governmental officials. Do you support this effort? If so, have you considered the basic issues of fairness when a pet project likely to result in legislative action that will remain trade and that will restrain trade and affect the lives of millions of Americans is promoted by the spouse of an elected official and rushed to a Senate hearing while important national business waits in the wings? Is it fair that people not fortunate enough to be married to a DC superstar have to keep their mouths shut while the Washington wives diddle with the legislative machinery? The PMRC is an unlicensed lobbying group comporting itself outrageously while threatening an entire industry with the wrath of their husbands' powerful committees. They bitchily spew frogwash and innuendo with the assistance of an utterly captivated media. When the PMRC's proposal leaps to a full committee hearing September 19th, an unfortunate precedent will be set. If you support the PMRC or the NMRC or any other fundamentalist pressure groups in their efforts to perpetuate the myth that sex equals sin, you will help institutionalize the neurotic misconception that keeps pornographers in business. In a nation where deranged pressure groups fight for the removal of sexual education from public schools, and parents know so little about sex that they have to call Dr. Ruth on TV for answers to rudimentary anatomical questions, it would seem infinitely more responsible for those esteemed wives and mothers to demand a full-scale congregational demystification of the subject. Are we headed toward a time when descriptions of sexual behavior in entertainment media can be obtained only by obtaining a lawyer to petition under the Freedom of Information Act? Must all sexual practices in the United States be tested and approved by the moral majority? When they test them, do we get to watch? The PMRC loudly decries the label of censorship when it is applied to their plan. Jesse Jackson reminded Jerry Falwell in a recent CNN debate, "You do not judge a tree by the bark it wears, but by the fruit it bears." ... Mr. President, if you're not serious about getting the government off our backs, could you at least do something about getting it out of our nostrils? There seems to be a lethal cloud of brimstone and mildewed bunting rising from the Senate floor. I do not expect a reply to this letter. However, any public statement from you on this matter would be greatly appreciated. Thank you, Frank Zappa. The president did not answer my letter. Instead, he gave a speech a short time later in Crystal City, Virginia, wherein he claimed that everybody in the record industry was a pornographer. Finally, on September 19, 1985, the Senate Committee, Technology and Transportation Committee, held a day of highly publicized hearings to discuss the PMRC's proposal, a kangaroo court. 5 of the committee's members had wives in the PMRC. And here it is. See if you can see that. I love it. So here we have Tribble, also known as Tipper. Here's Gore as another kangaroo. And then absent is Packwood. Here's Danforth, another kangaroo, Hollins, and looks like CBS was covering that. So here it is, page 268. Frank Zappa, Statement to Congress, September 19th, 1985. I was just turning 12 that week. These are my personal observations and opinions. I speak on behalf of no group or professional organization. My full statement has been supplied to you in advance. I wish it entered into congressional record. Since my speaking time has been limited to 10 minutes, I will read only part of it. I address my committees to the PMRC and the public as well as this committee. The PMRC proposal is an ill-conceived piece of nonsense which fails to deliver any real benefits to children, infringes on the civil liberties of people who are not children, and promises to keep the courts busy for years dealing with the interpersonal of it, and enforcemental problems inherent in the proposal's design. It is my understanding that in law, the First Amendment issues are decided with a preference for at least a restrictive alternative. In this context, the PMRC's demands are the equivalent of treating dandruff by decapitation. No one has forced Mrs. Baker or Mr. or Mrs. Gore to bring Prince or Sheena Easton into their homes. Thanks to the Constitution, they are free to buy other forms of music for their children. Apparently, they insist on purchasing the works of contemporary recording artists in order to support a personal illusion of aerobic sophistication. Ladies, please be advised. The $8.98 purchase price does not entitle you to a kiss on the foot from the composer or performer in exchange for a spin on the family Victrola. Taken as a whole, the complete list of PMRC demands reads like an instruction manual for some sinister kind of toilet training program to housebreak all composers and performers because of the ladies of a few. Ladies, how dare you? The ladies' shame must be treated by the bosses of the major labels who, through the RIAA, choose to bargain any of the rights of composers, performers, and retailers in order to pass H.R. 2911, the blank tape tax. A private tax levied by an industry on consumers for the benefit of a select group within that industry. Is this a consumer issue? You bet it is. PMRC spokesperson Katie Stroud announced to millions of fascinated viewers on last Friday's ABC Nightline debate that Senator Gore, a man she described as a friend of the music industry, is a co-sponsor of something she's referred to as anti-piracy legislation. Is this the same tax bill with a nicer name? The major record labels need to have H.R. 2911 whiz through a few committees before anybody smells a rat. One of them is chaired by Senator Thurmond. It is a coincidence that Mrs. Thurmond is affiliated with the PMRC. I can't say if she's a member, because the PMRC has no members. Their secretary told me on the phone last Friday that the PMRC has no members, only founders. I asked how many other DC wives are non-members of an organization that raises money by mail, has tax-exempt status, and seems intent on running the Constitution of the United States through the family paper shredder. I asked her if it was a cold. Finally, she said she couldn't give me an answer, that she was going to call their lawyer. While the wife of the Secretary of the Treasury recites, "Gonna drive my love inside you," Senator Gore's wife talks about bondage, oral sex at gunpoint. On the CBS Evening News, people in high places work on a tax bill that is so ridiculous, the only way to sneak it through is to keep the public's mind on something else. Porn rock. The PMRC practices a curious double standard with these fervent recantations. Thanks to them, hopeless young children all over America get to hear about oral sex at gunpoint on network TV several nights a week. Is there a secret FCC dispensation here? What sort of end justifies these means? PTA parents should keep an eye on these ladies if that's their idea of good taste. Is the basic issue morality? Is it mental health? Is it an issue at all? The PMRC has created a lot of confusion with improper comparisons between song lyrics, videos, and record packaging, radio broadcasting, and live performances. These are all different mediums, and the people who work in them have the right to conduct their business without trade restraining legislation whipped up like an instant pudding by the wives of our big brother. Is it proper for the husband of a non-PMRC, non-founder / member / person sits on any committee considering business pertaining to the blank tape tax or his wife's lobbying organization? Can any committee thus constitutional Zappa thus constituted find facts in a fair and unbiased manner? This committee has 3. A minor conflict of interest. The PMRC promotes their program as a harmless type of consumer information service, providing guidelines which will assist baffled parents in their determination of the, quote, stability, unquote, of records listened to by, quote, very young children, end quote. The methods they propose have several unfortunate side effects, not the least of which is the reduction of all American music recorded and live to the intellectual level of a Saturday morning cartoon show. Teenagers with $8.98 in their pocket might go to the record store alone, but very young children do not. Usually there is a parent in attendance. The $8.98 is in the parent's pocket. The parent can always suggest that the $8.98 be spent on a book. If the parent is afraid to let the child read a book, perhaps the $8.98 can be spent on the recordings of instrumental music. Why not bring jazz or classical music into your home instead of Blackie Lawless or Madonna? Great music with no words at all is available to anyone with the sense enough to look beyond this week's platinum-selling fashion plate. Children in the vulnerable age bracket have a natural love for music. If, as a parent, you believe they should be exposed to something more uplifting than sugar walls, support music appreciation programs in schools. Why haven't you considered your child's need for consumer information? Music appreciation costs very little compared to sports expenditures. Your children have a right to know that something besides pop music exists. It is unfortunate that PMRC would rather dispense governmentally sanitized heavy metal music than something more uplifting. It is an indication of PMRC's personal taste, not just another manifestation of low priority for this administration has placed on education and arts in America. The answer is, of course, is neither. You can't distract people from thinking about an unfair tax by talking about music appreciation. For that, you need sex, and lots of it. Because of the subjective nature of the PMRC ratings, it is impossible to guarantee that some sort of despised concept won't sneak through. Tucked away in new slang or the overstressed pronunciation of an otherwise innocent word. If the goal is here to total verbal moral safety, there was only one way to achieve it. Watch no TV, read no books, see no movies, listen only to instrumental music, or buy no music at all. The establishment of a rating system, voluntary or otherwise, opens the door to an endless parade of moral quality control programs based on things certain Christians don't like. What if the next bunch of Washington wives demand a large yellow J on all material written or performed by Jews in order to save helpless children from the exposure to concealed Zionist doctrine? Record ratings are frequently compared to film ratings. Apart from the quantitative difference, there is another that is more important. People who act in films are hired to pretend. No matter how the film is rated, it won't hurt them personally. Since many musicians write and perform their own material and stand by it as their art, whether you like it or not, an imposed rating will stigmatize them as individuals. How long before composers and performers are told to wear festive little PMRC armband with their scarlet letter on it? The PMRC rating system restrains trade in one specific musical field, rock. No ratings have been requested for comedy records or country music. Is there anyone in the PMRC who can differentiate infallibly between rock and country music? Artists in both fields cross stylistic lines. Some artists include comedy material. If an album is part rock, part comedy, what sort of label would get it? Shouldn't the ladies be warning everyone inside the country albums with American flags, the big trucks, and the atomic pompadours? There lurks a fascinating variety of songs about sex, violence, alcohol, and the devil, recorded in a way that lets you hear every word, sung for you by people who have been to prison and are proud of it. If enacted, the PMRC program would have the effect of protectionist legislation for the country music industry, providing more security for cowboys than it does for children. One major retail outlet has already informed the Capitol Records sales staff that it would not purchase or display an album with any kind of sticker on it. Another chain with outlets and shopping malls have been told by the landlord that if it racked hard-rated albums, they would lose their lease. That opens up an awful lot of shelf space for somebody. Could it be that a certain senatorial husband and wife team from Tennessee sees this as an affirmative action program to benefit the suffering multitudes in Nashville? The PMRC attempting to save future generations from sex itself. The type, the amount, and the timing of sexual information given to a child should be determined by parents, not by people who are involved in a tax scheme cover-up. The PMRC has concocted a mythical beast and compounds the chancery by demanding consumer guidelines to keep it from inviting your children inside its sugar walls. Is the next step the adoption of a PMRC national legal age for comprehension of vaginal arousal? Many people in the room will gladly support such legislation, but before they start drafting their bill, I urge them to consider these facts. 1. There is no conclusive scientific evidence to support the claim that exposure of any form of music will cause the listener to commit a crime or damn his soul to hell. 2. Masturbation is not illegal. If it is not illegal to do it, why should it be illegal to sing about it? 3. No medical evidence of hairy palms, warts, or blindness has been linked to masturbation or vaginal arousal, nor has been proven that hearing references to either topic automatically turns the listener into a social liability. 4. Enforcement of an anti-masturbatory legislation could prove costly and time-consuming. 5. There is not enough prison space to hold all the children who do it. The PMRC's proposal is the most offensive in its moral tone. It seeks to enforce a set of implied religious values on its victims. Iran has a religious government. Good for them. I like having the capital of the United States in Washington, D.C., in spite of the recent efforts to move it to Lynchburg, Virginia. Fundamentalism is not a state religion. The PMRC's request for labels regarding sexually explicit lyrics, violence, drugs, alcohol, and especially occult content reads like a catalog of phenomena inherent to practitioners of that faith. How could a person who worships in a private matter and should be not inflicted upon or exploited by others? Understanding the fundamentalist leanings of the organization, I think it is fair to wonder if their rating system will eventually be extended to inform parents as to whatever musical group has homosexuals in it. Well, the PMRC permit musical groups to exist, but only if gay members don't sing and are not depicted on the album cover. The PMRC has demanded that record companies reevaluate the contracts of these groups who do things on stage that they find offensive. I remind the PMRC that groups are comprised of individuals. If one guy wiggles too much, does that whole band get an X? If the group gets dropped from the label as a result of this reevaluation process, do the other guys in the group who weren't wiggling get to sue the guy who wiggled because he ruined their careers? Do the founders of the tax-exempt organizations with no members plan to indemnify record companies for any losses incurred by an unfavorably decided breach of contract suits, or is there a PMRC secret agent of the Justice Department? Should individual musicians be rated? If so, who is qualified to determine if the guitar player is an X, the vocalist is a D/A, or the drummer is a V? If the bass player or his senator belongs to a religious group that dances around with the poisonous snakes, does he get an O? What if he has an earring in one ear, wears an Italian horn around his neck, sings about his astrological sign, practices yoga, reads the Kabbalah, or owns a rosary? Will his, quote, occult content, end quote, rating go into an old Co-Intel Pro computer, emerging later as a fact? to determine if he qualifies for a homeowner loan. Will they tell you if this is necessary to protect the folks next door from the possibility of devil worship lyrics creeping through the wall? What hazards await the unfortunate retailer who accidentally sells an O to record companies to record to somebody's little Johnny? Nobody in Washington seems to care when Christian terrorists bombed abortion clinics in the name of Jesus. Will you care when the Friends of the Wives of Big Brother blow up the shopping mall? The PMRC wants ratings to start as the date of their enactment. That leaves the current crop of objectionable material untouched. What will be the status of recordings from the golden era prior to censorship? Do they become collector's items? ... Or will another fair and unbiased committee order them destroyed in a public ceremony? Bad facts make bad law. And people who write bad laws are, in my opinion, more dangerous than songwriters who celebrate sexuality. Freedom of speech, freedom of religious thought, and the right to due process for composers, performers, and retailers are implied if the PMRC and the major labels consummate this nasty bargain. Are we expected to give up Article 1 so the big guys can collect an extra $1 on every blank tape and 10 to 25% on tape recorders? What's going on here? Do we get to vote on this tax? There's an awful lot of smoke pouring out in the legislative machinery used by the PMRC to inflate this issue. Try not to inhale it. Those responsible for the vandalism should pay for the damage by voluntarily rating themselves. If they refuse, perhaps the voters could assist in awarding a constitutional X, the congregational DA, the congressional V, and the congressional O. Just like the ladies say, these ratings are necessary to protect our children. I hope it's not too late to put them where they really belong. Period. Page 276. I testified before the Senate committee along with John Denver and Dee Snider. My only regret of this episode is that under the rules of the hearing, I was not afforded an opportunity to respond when I was denounced by a semi-populogenic Slate Gordon, former Republican senator from Washington State, for my constitutional ignorance. I would have liked to remind him that although I flunked just about everything else in high school, I did get an A in civics. As if he wanted to tell me I was just an ignorant musician, why didn't he use the, quote, Ted Koppel method, end quote, and say, now, Mr. Zappa, you're an intelligent man. Anybody who gets that reaction from Ted twice in an episode of Nightline has surely been told how stupid he is. One of the best lines of the afternoon came from Senator James Exxon of Nebraska, Democrat. Not exactly a liberal guy, I asked. I wonder, Mr. Chairman, if we're not talking about federal regulation and we're not talking about federal legislation, what is the reason for these hearings? This received great applause, but it was not carried by the network news. Exxon also pointed out that these hearings were better attended by audience and media, 35 TV feeds, 50 still photographers, than any other legislative procedure he had been involved with, including hearings on the budget and Star Wars. A few months later, the RIAA caved in, and on November 1st, 1985, agreed to place warning stickers on potentially offending albums reading explicit lyrics, parental advisory. The timing was interesting. The agreement was announced just a few days after the Senate version of the blank tape tax received a committee hearing, October 30th, 1985. And who was listed as one of the bill's co-sponsors? Senator Albert Gore, of course. When Jack Valenti, the president of the Motion Picture Association of America, asked Tipper Gore how many of the records released every year she should put into objectionable category, Tipper said 5%. If 5% of the records are objectionable to the PMRC, the process of stickering is further mitigated by the looseness of the agreement. It is not surprisingly that in the years since the RIAA's agreement with the PMRC was made, only a few albums had stickers on them placed on albums, either because the group thought it would be a sales tool or because they had the clout and the record company stuck them with it. Shortly after the second anniversary of that agreement, the PMRC asked for a review of the agreement because there had been non-compliance. The fact is, not many people do albums with lyrics that they would object to, and most of those who do are signed to record companies with which are not members of the RIAA and are not covered by the lady's pathetic little non-agreement. The PMRC's list of people signed to member labels of the RIAA who were, quote, offensive, end quote, in 1985 was pretty ridiculous. The Captain and Tennille were on it for Do That To Me One More Time. The Jacksons were on it for Torture. Bruce Springsteen for I'm on Fire. And of course Prince for the fabulous Darling Nikki, which I am about to perform to you. At least the first part here. She was a sex fiend. Met her in a hotel lobby, masturbating with a magazine. And, okay, so enough of that there, but I bet you never heard that on the mandolin before. Anyways, I remember that song when I was 12, no, 11. My friends were playing it to an 8-year-old girl. And she liked that song. She was laughing at it. And there were no parents there. Ooh, how horrible. Yeah. Where was he throughout all of this? He went apeshit and sued some spaghetti company for calling their product Prince, but remained curiously silent during the records rating stuff. None of the artists who made it into the list, which became known as the PMRC's Filthy 15, had anything in their lyrics even close to the stuff in my catalog. And yet, for some reason, I was never accused of being a, quote, violator, end quote. You want a sticker? I'll give you a sticker! Because of the dispute with MCA, musicians, Symmetry of America Records, which had contracted to distribute Barking Pumpkin Records in 1983, I invented my own sticker. MCA planned to release Thingfish. The deal was done. There were up to the test pressing stage. A woman in the quality control department of their pressing plant listened to my album and became quite upset. Because she was offended, MCA backed out of the deal. So in 1984, I prepared this little item. A little devil there. Page 279. This is a warning / guarantee. This album contains material which a truly free society will neither fear nor suppress. In a socially retarded areas, religious fanatics and ultra-conservative political organizations violate your First Amendment rights by attempting to censor rock and roll albums. We feel this is unconstitutional and un-American. As an alternative to these government-supported programs designed to keep you docile and ignorant, Barking Pumpkin is pleased to provide stimulating digital audio entertainment for those of you who have outgrown the ordinary. The language and concepts contained herein are guaranteed not to cause eternal torment in the place where the guy with the horns and the pointed stick conducts his business. This guarantee is not as real as the threats of video fundamentalists who use the attacks on rock music in their attempt to transform America into a nation of check-mailing nincompoops in the name of Jesus Christ. If there is a hell, its fires wait for them, not us. Now what? The agreement between the PMRC and the RIAA is, for all intents and purposes, unforeseeable. Now, the PMRC has moved into the world of video, complaining about television, home video, and MTV. Paradoxically, Al Gore introduced legislation that the world would make it easier for people in Tennessee to get cable service, bringing MTV and slasher videos into an entertainment-starved backwoods homes. There were a lot of things that didn't add up during the PMRC episode. It seemed to me, and I asked in interviews at the time, that the whole business looked like the ground floor of a presidential campaign for the junior senator from Tennessee. Making gorgeous music off his Super Tuesday efforts, Senator Albert Gore Jr. of Tennessee says he's now ready to rock and roll to the Democratic presidential nomination. Off to the sales of his record, I Want Your Sex, George Michael says now he's ready to rock and roll all the way to the bank. Yes, folks, as strange as it may sound, there is a connection. Michael credits Gore's wife, Tipper, and helping to push his album Faith, which contains the sex song, way to the multi-million sales. 3 million copies sold in this country alone. How so? Because Mrs. G had been so outspoken against obscene lyrics in rock music, says Michael. Quote, perhaps now she can help sell a few thousand more records since her husband won big in the primaries, end quote, Michael said in Perth, Australia, where he is performing. And there's a picture here of the PMRC headquarters, a non-profit tax-exempt organization. Meanwhile, Gore for president! Page 281. Gore won in 6 states. And in Super Tuesday primaries. And here's something, let's see. New York Daily News, March 11, 1988 says, as Americans like to say, there was much hoopla about nothing, Michael said about the lyrics of the song. It was, after all, just a pop record. Following up on this, a CNN show called Crossfire covered the PMRC topic with me as a guest. The first time in 1985, when I was told the guy from the Washington Times to kiss my ass. And then again in 1987, when George Michael's sex song was controversial. Believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, the premise of the second debate on Crossfire was, and don't laugh, does rock music cause AIDS? With an opening bumper that included clips from Mr. Michael's video. The Blacklist. The first time I got involved with the PMRC issues was when I debated Candy Stroud in Washington, D.C. on CBS Night Watch in August 1985. It was supposed to be a 1-hour taped debate in front of a live audience, which happened to include Stroud's young children listening raptly. His mom recited the familiar litany of oral sex at gunpoint, etc., etc. During the audience question and answer session, a Washington, D.C. disc jockey named Surf stated that the whole thing reminded him of the radio blacklist days, when certain artists and records were forbidden to be played on the air. That grabbed my attention. Several things that were edited out of the show by that time finally made it went on the air, and that was one of them. The following week, I was in New York doing a live radio interview on WNEW-FM. I was talking with the disc jockey about the Blacklist days. I asked him, have you ever seen one? Yeah, he said, I've seen it. You've seen the Blacklist? I said. Would you go to court and say that you have? And then the guy started to get really worried. After the Commerce Committee hearing on September 19th, I began doing a lot of interviews on the PMRC topic. Sometime in November, right after the RIAA made their stupid agreement with the PMRC, I was back in New York, and one of the people who came there to interview me had hired to write an article for Playboy magazine. She had heard the radio broadcast on WNEW with the reference to the Blacklist, and though the Freedom of Information Act, she managed to actually get her hands on one. She showed it to me and explained that the reason the people haven't seen the Blacklist before is that when you try to find one through the Freedom of Information Act, they don't help you. You have to ask exactly the right agency for exactly the right documents, or you don't get them. who would ever thinking of asking the Department of Defense for a blacklist of pop songs? She did. And that's where it came from. It was dated April 1971 or 72, and it had Puff the Magic Dragon on it, along with maybe 19 other songs. So here's the DOD and a fire-breathing dragon. The blacklist wasn't just one piece of paper. It was a stack a couple of inches thick, included all the corresponding FCC documents. It appeared that they were helping to implement the restraints and violation of their charter, and she was going to write them an article about it in Playboy. It never appeared. I don't know where she is. I don't know what happened to the blacklist. 3 other journalists were sitting in the room when she came in. A guy from Cashbox and 2 women from High Times. And the list was shown to them. She thought she had a scoop, and she wasn't going to show the whole bunch of documents to everybody. But a few of the people saw it, as I did, and said, I don't believe this. True confessions. On February 14th, 1986, the Maryland State Senate Judiciary Committee held a meeting on a bill proposed by Delegate Judith Toth to modify the existing state pornography statute so as to include records, tapes, and CDs. The bill had already been passed by the Maryland House of Delegates, and a Senate vote in favor would have been placed into it in the law in Maryland, creating a dangerous national precedent. Maryland has had some funny ideas as to what constitutes pornography. Considering it was my home state, I thought that at least I could do was to help keep its citizens from making a total fool of themselves. So I went there to offer my testimony. The night before the hearing, the lobbyist hired by the RIAA, Mr. Bruce Barino, threw a cocktail reception in Annapolis so I could meet a few of the state delegates. It was an evening of handshaking, autograph signing, and posing for pictures. As I was introduced to each legislator, I asked which way he or she had voted. The bill, after all, had already been passed by the House by 96 to 30 or thereabouts. The delegates were honest and told me frankly how they had voted, and if they said they had voted for the bill, I gave them a pretty good razz. I said, this is your last chance to recant. All you have to do is fill out this piece of paper and say you change your position. I got 5 of them to write confessions of that reception, and the next day of the hearing, I said, here are the confessions of the delegates who realize that this bill is really bad and wish they had never signed it. The next day of the hearing, I read their names and confessions to the record. Page 284. On your feet, on your knees. I was able to acquire videotape of the Senate proceedings in 1987, just as I was editing together the first of the Honker Home Video projects. I decided to combine parts of my testimony with the actual statements made by Mrs. Toth and Delegate Owens in a way that would dramatize the issue, and included this 1-hour show called Video from Hell. This is a transcription of the dialogue as it is edited from that show. The testimony before Maryland, the state legislature, February 14th, 1986. A bill proposed by Delegate Judith Toth to modify the existing pornography statute so as to include records, tapes, and CDs had been passed by the Maryland House of Delegates. Frank Zappa says, "It is my personal feeling that lyrics cannot harm anyone. There is no sound that you can make with your mouth or word that comes out of your mouth that is so powerful that it will make you go to hell. It's also not going to turn anyone to a social liability. Disturbed people can be set off on a disturbed course of action by any kind of stimulus. If they are prone to being antisocial or schizophrenic or whatever, they can be set off by anything, including my tie or your hair or the chair over there. You can't point to the statistics concerning people doing strange things in the vicinity of rock music because all you have to do is look around all the normal kids who listen to it and live with every day, who do not commit suicide, do not commit murder, and they grow up to be, in some cases, legislators." And then Delegate Joseph Owens, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, says, "This is probably the worst type of child abuse we have in this case because it hits the children. This is mass child abuse, and that's what it is. When they throw some of this slime at these children, it's abuse." Frank Zappa says, "To say that rock music is the worst form of child abuse and mass abuse is sky-high rhetoric." Delegate Judith Toth says, "We're not talking about references to sex. We're talking about references to incest. Incest. And it says, do it, kids. It's fine. We're talking about rape and sexual violence. It's illegal in this state. But these records get out there and they say, do it, kids. It feels good. It's fine. It's okay. You've got to read this stuff and just to know how dirty it is." Frank Zappa says, "Did you guys read this?" And then he laughs. "Or did you guys read the synopsis?" Toth says, "This is pornography." Frank Zappa says, "This is censorship. I oppose this bill for a number of reasons. First of all, there's no need for it. The idea that lyrics to a song are going to cause antisocial behavior is not supported by science." Toth says, "This bill is constitutional. We're talking about minors in the first place. And stop worrying about their civil rights. Stop worrying about their mental health and the health of our society." Frank Zappa says, "The bill seeks to keep people from seeing, renting, buying, or listening to material described as depicting illicit sex, and the description of what constitutes illicit sex as per this bill includes human genitals in a state of sexual stimulus or arousal." Is that illicit sex? Perhaps in Maryland. Laughter. Acts of human masturbation, not animal masturbation. This is talking about human masturbation as an illicit sexual act. More laughter. Sexual intercourse or sodomy. Why does this bill indicate that sexual intercourse is illicit sex and put it next to sodomy in the same line? The next line reads, fondling or other erotic touching of human genitals. That is, quote, illicit, end quote. In the state of Maryland, according to the law as already written, and then Owen's response here. The thing is, they know what they've got. They know what they're selling. And that's what they're trying to sell. Because it's the only thing they could, because that's the only thing they could sell to minors. Frank Zappa says, finally, on this list, we find nude or partially denuded figures, meaning less than completely and opaquely covered human genitals, pubic region, buttocks, or female breasts below the point of immediately above or on top of the areola. More laughter. Now, I like nipples. I think they look nice. And if you take off the nipple, which is the characterizing demeaning factor, what you got is a blob of fat there. Laughter. And I think that when you're a baby, probably one of the first things that you get interested is the nozzle right there. More laughter. You have to get it right up in front of your face. You grow up with it, so to speak. And when you grow up and live in the state of Maryland, and they don't let you see the little brown nozzle anymore, the top. I am not against artistic creativity. I am not for censorship. I think adults have the right to listen and see whatever they want. But we're talking about children here. This is going to affect children. Frank Zappa says, when some people start talking about pornography and their desire to save the children, they sometimes choose strange ways to express that desire. Some of the statements made in support of this bill are absurd. I think you have problems in the law as it already exists, let alone amending it to include audio references to these so-called illicit sexual acts that are already in this document. Because the bill talks about not being able to advertise matter containing these objectionable objects, it opens up the following possibility. A person wearing a Motley Crue t-shirt, if Motley Crue was adjudged by whatever form is going to make these decisions to be a pornographic act, theoretically could be fined $1,000 or going to jail for a year because of his wardrobe. And if he wore it twice, it's $5,000 or imprisonment, not to exceed 3 years or both. The show ends with me talking over the credits in an interview with a Maryland TV station, giving the final chapter to this silly story. Frank Zappa says here, do you want an example of censorship growing out of this bill? Censorship doesn't always work by somebody taking a pencil and crossing a line out of a book or forcing a record off the shelves. There are other forms of censorship. I recently offered the Peabody Conservatory my services to teach for a couple of weeks, but they were afraid that if they brought me in to teach, they would lose their funding from the state, because the people who supported the censorship bill had the power to remove funding from the entire Peabody Conservatory. Judith Toth's bill was killed in the Maryland State Judiciary Committee. Other states have considered similar legislation. Delegate Toth has vowed to reintroduce her bill in order to bring the record industry to its knees. Page 288. More initials to watch for. Governmental agencies and groups like PMRC find promotion easier when their bullshit is concealed behind an acronym. The aura these organizations hope to generate from the use of the acronym, which could be scientifically described as the acronymbus, and any person believing that such an aura certifies competence could be scientifically described as an acronymbus. Acronymbus. William Stitting is the founder of the NMRC, the National Music Review Council. He owns 2 radio stations, one in Dallas and one in Salt Lake City, owned by the Mormon Church. I received a flyer in the mail from his group talking about their idea for cleaning up lyrics. The PMRC wanted to put the Scarlet Letter on offensive LPs. The NMRC wanted to put an attaboy sticker on albums indicating that it contains nothing objectionable. At stations, when a new record came in, somebody would listen to it, decide if what he didn't like, transfer the record to tape, edit the tape, and play the, quote, clean, end quote, tape on the air instead of the record. That was rather deceptive. Some unsuspecting listener hearing the Stenning version, I might think it was a harmless little ditty, go out and buy the record, only to find out later about some leather weasel getting cornholed. The NMRC plan gets it in both ways. A station could play supposedly hot music without worrying about losing its broadcast license to the FCC. When groups like this go after show business itself, or so many people have skeletons in their closets, they often go unchallenged. Albert Gore set up a committee to investigate payola in the record industry and held his own little hearings shortly after his wife's day in the spotlight just to keep the pressure on, and then had the nerve to come to Hollywood, meeting with the same folks whose livelihood and his wife were threatening, and asked for presidential campaign contributions. As I said before, nobody looks good with brown lipstick on, but Al Gore looks ridiculous. Who's paying the bills? During a debate with Jennifer Norwood from the PMRC, Jella Biafra of the Dead Kennedys said, "Who's paying the bills?" Norwood blurred out that the PMRC was funded by Occidental and Merrill Lynch. Our pension plan is with Merrill Lynch. So Gail called and talked with the head man. If they were, in fact, supporting the PMRC and it was going to cost them on our account, he insisted it wasn't company policy. Apparently, a call had gone out for people to, quote, donate, end quote, for PMRC picnic. Somebody at Merrill Lynch in Washington, D.C. had noticed that Mrs. Packwood was a signatory to the PMRC letter, and at that time, Senator Packwood was the chairman of the Finance Committee. So, here's a guy at Merrill Lynch thinking that if he makes a contribution to the PMRC, he'll get to go to the picnic, meet Mrs. Packwood, and thereby get his elbow into Mr. Packwood. Back in control. Back in control as an entity which, for a price, will take a child and remodel its behavior to suit the needs and desires of a concerned parent. In her book, Raising PG Kids in an X-Rated Society, Tipper Gore recommends this group. If you want to follow Tipper's advice and use the company's services, here's what you might expect. For example, if you think that your child is showing signs of becoming a punker or a heavy metaler, this entity and others scattered around the United States will depunk or demetalize your child, leaving you free to go sports fishing. Parents who find themselves baffled by the arcane behavior of today's young people can now just sort of ship the little buggers off to psycho camp If you're interested in disposing of your kids in this manner, Back in Control offers a pamphlet listing clues as to what danger signs are. One of them is, don't laugh, if the child is wearing tennis shoes. Yes, that's a sure sign of evil opening up at ground level. The pamphlet includes a section on symbols, which indicate the possibility of satanic or demonic behavior. One of the symbols was the Star of David. Back in Control people said they saw the Star of David on an Ozzy Osbourne album. What a jokester Ozzy is. I understand now that they have been forced to modify that section of the pamphlet. For some reason, they don't like me very much. I got a hold of a letter written by the head guy putting me in the same category as Joseph Goebbels and Senator Joseph McCarthy, claiming that I was using the big lie technique against them. Phew! Send your children here. Need help? Class is now forming. Services available. Spanking, flogging, thrashing, Bible study. Call our convenient 24-hour toll-free number at 1-800-666-6666 today. Page 291. If the scare tactic of the group of the PMRC and Back in Control have not made an impact on musicians, they have certainly made one of the executives of the record company tell me artists what labels will or will not accept as suitable material under the artist contract. If you make a record, you will not automatically assured that the song you wrote will be recorded, will reach the marketplace, because some coward in the record company may come up and say he can't allow it to escape it for moral reasons. If the artist can't sing this song he wants to sing, release the record he wants to release, and then earn a living he is entitled to earn from doing what he loves, he is cheated, and the audience is cheated because they don't get to hear the best work of the artist, only that which he is allowed to release. Will the artists ever get back in control? Tune in again tomorrow, folks.